you. I'm so glad that you were able to get your whole clock figured out and be here at the right time. That's always important, right? Yeah, I'm thankful for my cell phone being my alarm clock, because then I don't have to worry about it, and it just kind of adjusts itself. If we could just get the rest of the clocks in the house to do that, that would be wonderful. Oh man, it is such a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to gather together, to worship, to celebrate what Christ has done on our behalf, to look forward to what Christ is still doing on our behalf, to look forward to heaven. How many of you get a little bit excited when we talk about heaven? You know, a third of us. The others, I don't know what's going on with the rest of us. What's that? Oh, it won't be. I raised my hand. You know, maybe that says something. Yeah, man, it's so exciting to think about what God is up to in the world and what God wants to do in our world and in and through us. You know, we talk about missions and what God is up to in the world, but even what God is doing here. You know, really, there's only one mission. You know, so missions is kind of a, you know, there really is only one. It's to make great the name of Christ, and for us, you know, we say it this way, that our mission is to honor God by making more and better followers of Jesus. Amen. You know, whether that's here or around the world or any of these places where we see all these flags represented, you know, that is our mission, to honor God by making more and better followers of Jesus. So that's what we're here for. You know, and you know, we have the privilege to gather together. We sing together, which is an awesome opportunity we have to worship and to celebrate what God has done on our behalf. But then also we spend some time looking into His Word, you know, because He gives us some instructions for how to live our lives while we're still here. You know, in fact, we're in this series through the book of James, and we're calling this series, you know, James, a field guide for life. You know, in the book of James, there's so many practical topics, so many different things that James talks about that are just so relevant to us that we're taking a chunk of time. In fact, we're on week 10 now through the book of James. We still got 3 more weeks before we get into our Christmas series. And we're kind of dissecting some of the things that we're reading in the book of James, and we're seeing how it applies to us. And as you know, because it's such a long series, we've tried to break it down into some more manageable sections. So we've kind of had 3 mini-series so far, and this is the last week of the mini-series that we've been talking about with contrasting worldviews. You know, thinking about, you know, how we see things. You know, we've looked at, we've looked at our heavenly worldview and also an earthly worldview. And remember, our worldview is kind of the lens through which we see reality. It's the lens through which we see things. It's our value system. It's our beliefs, and it affects not only how we see the world, but it also affects the decisions that we make. And as Christ followers, our worldview is deeply shaped by God's Word. And so we're trying to evaluate all of the things that kind of go on around us through the lens of Scripture. And the reality is we desire to see things from God's perspective. And His Word gives us His perspective on life. So that's what we're doing. And so far in this mini-series, we've talked about 2 different kinds of wisdom. We've looked at earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. And in fact, we mentioned that earthly wisdom is self-centered and short-sighted, right? It's all about here and now. And that's the way that most of our world lives. It's very self-centered. And it's short-sighted. It's about here and now. Whereas heavenly wisdom is focused on God. It is God-focused, and it's others-oriented. Heavenly wisdom is all about God, and it's about people. That's why throughout Scripture we see that we're supposed to love God and we're supposed to love people. The great commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Last week we talked about 2 different pursuits in life. We can pursue pleasure or we can pursue God, but we cannot pursue both. That's what we talked about. And today is kind of a continuation on that same theme. In fact, today we're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject. We're going to talk about money. Yeah, don't you just love talking about money? In fact, people get nervous when we talk about money, especially in church. You know, it's like, ooh, now you're beginning to meddle. You know, and if this is your first week here, we don't always talk about money. We talk about it periodically, and we also talk about it when it comes up in our text. So because we're going through this, and we're going to be talking a little bit about money today. Don't get nervous, you know. Actually, we're going to talk about wealth, and specifically today, we're going to talk about greed. Greed. Greed is an issue that we need to talk about because it's something that we're plagued with, especially as Americans. And so we need to look at, how do we overcome the issue of greed? Now, to kind of start us off with some clarification of terms, what is greed? Here's a pretty good definition of greed. Greed is excessive desire for more of something, especially wealth or possessions. That's a pretty good definition, right? It is the excessive desire for more of something, especially wealth or possessions. It's not saying that we can't have things. It's not saying that we can't have wealth. We can't have possessions. But when we have this excessive desire for it, it becomes a problem. And I think that you would agree with me that this is certainly a problem that many of us face, especially in our country. And so we kind of have this problem in our culture that the more we have, the more we want. And we want more and more. In fact, let me ask, have you ever wanted something kind of so bad, and then once you got it, then you're like, well, I need something else now? Does that happen to anybody else? Or there's like four of us sinners in the room right now? Really? Yeah, you just want something so bad, and you're kind of researching. I'm a researcher, when it comes to purchasing things. I don't typically impulse shop, but I will research something to death, to the point where by the time it's time to make the purchase, it's sold now. It's like we don't have that anymore. So I'll be looking for this thing, and once you finally get it, it's like, all right, well, what's next? What's next? You've been shopping for the car, and now you got the car thing. What's next? Well, now, I probably need some accessories for the car. And so we just kind of go from one thing to the next. If I could just only have this one thing, I will be so happy for at least a week. Or maybe 2 weeks, and then we want something else. There's a little bit of greed in each of us, I believe. And so James talks about this practical thing of how do we overcome it? Because with greed, it's never enough. We always want more. The more we have, the more we want. So go ahead and turn to James chapter 5. James chapter 5, that's page 979. If you're using one of our Bibles, page 979. If you don't have a Bible, feel free to take it home with you. We'd love for you to have that. James chapter 5. Now, greed is not a new problem. Okay, you need to know this. Greed is not a new problem. It's a very old problem. It's talked about in the Old Testament quite a bit. In fact, in Ecclesiastes 5:10, it says this. And Solomon writes this. Okay, Solomon, one of the richest people that's ever lived. He says, "Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income." And then he says, "This too is meaningless." Listen, we feel like we can never have enough. So greed is not a new problem. It's a very old problem. But here's the other thing. The solution to greed is also not a new solution. It's a very old solution. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But before we talk about the solution, let's talk a little bit more about the problem. And we see this in James chapter 5. James 5, beginning verse 1, says this. "Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages that you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." Wow, that's a nice gut check, right? Aren't you so glad you came to church today? Well, that was just so encouraging. I'm just going to read that over and over again this week. I'm going to make that my Facebook post this week. Hey, all my friends, just want you to know how the Bible is speaking to me. This is it. So sometimes, we read scriptures like, man, that's just hard. Or that seems harsh, that doesn't seem fair. And here James, he addresses this age-old problem of greed. And for right now, I just want to focus on just the first 5 words. First 5 words of verse 1 says this. "Now listen, you rich people." Now here's what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, "Phew, I'm off the hook," because he's talking to somebody else. It's not about me because I'm not rich. So I get a week off. You need to know something. You are rich. You are rich. Now, we don't always feel rich, do we? But we are rich. And we've kind of talked about this, periodically throughout the past several years, but the reality is, you and I, we are rich. We don't feel rich. There's a couple of reasons why we don't feel rich, let me tell you. One of them is this, because there's somebody else that's richer. We don't feel rich because we compare ourselves to other people, right? So sometimes we don't feel rich because, well, I'm not, no, the definition of rich is somebody that makes probably twice as much as what I make. That's kind of the way we define rich, somebody that makes twice as much as we do. So if you make $40,000, you're not rich. The person that makes $80,000, they're the rich person. The person that makes $100,000, oh, I'm not rich. The person that makes $200,000, that's somebody that's rich. So we kind of have this messed up mentality of what rich means. So that's one reason why we don't feel rich, is because we compare ourselves to others. Another reason why we don't feel rich is because we spend more than we make. We spend more than we make. And as long as we spend more than we make, we have bills that exceed our income. And as long as we have bills, we feel like, well, I don't have enough money because I have all of these bills. Therefore, I must not be rich. But let's face it, most of the time that's because of our own foolish decisions, not because of the income that God has blessed us with. So we don't feel rich, but we are rich. We've mentioned this before. So just kind of a quick factoid for you. The truth is this: if you make $33,000 a year, you're in the top 1% of the world's richest people. Let that sink in for just a minute. If you make $33,000 a year, you're in the top 1% of the world's richest people. Now, we had Bob and Delore, they shared with us earlier, and I think Bob said that there are people that are coming to the marketplace and they're working and they're making $2 or $3 a day. Let that sink in for a little bit. So if you make $33,000 a year, you're in the top 1% of the world's richest people. Even if you're making minimum wage and you're working full-time, you're still in the top 5% of the world's richest people. At minimum wage here, where we live. And perhaps you're thinking, well, yeah, that's worldwide, yeah, I get it. But here's something that you need to know. Most likely, even in this audience, you're probably rich compared to the people in our own backyards. You realize that, right? We are rich. We've been blessed with so much. See, the definition of rich is this: it's having substantially more than what you need. Having substantially more than what you need. And I believe that if you were to evaluate your life, and you were to look at your house, and look at your car, and look at all of the things that you have, same thing for myself, I have substantially more than what I need. I am rich. I bring that all up just so that we're all on the same page. So when we look at this text, when it says, now listen, you rich people, that you don't just dismiss it and say that's for somebody else. The truth is we are rich, and here James tells us that this is a problem that we need to be extra careful about, because riches can present us with a serious problem. And the problem is not money. It's not a money problem. The problem is a heart problem. And so we need to evaluate our hearts. See, money is an inanimate object, right? It doesn't have feelings. It has no will of its own. So the problem isn't money, and it's not about us having money. The problem is when money has us and when it controls us. That's when it becomes a problem. Which brings us to kind of our main idea for today. And I'm going to mention this several times throughout today's talk, just so that hopefully it'll sink in. It's this: when we loosen our grip on money, money loosens its grip on us. When we loosen our grip on money, money loosens its grip on us. But if we hold this tight grip on money, it's going to have a tight grip on us. It will control us. It will consume us. And it will become an unsuspecting idol in our lives. I think a week or two ago we talked about idolatry and how we're supposed to worship God and worship God alone, right? And idolatry is just misdirected worship. That's all that it is. And oftentimes that thing that we worship is money or possessions or wealth or those things that we can accumulate. See, greed is a heart problem more than a money problem. And James warns us what happens when money gets out of control, or when this problem gets out of control. And in this text, he uses several key words that point to this heart condition known as greed. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to share 3 heart conditions that stem from greed, and then we're going to talk about the antidote to this growing problem that we have. The first heart problem is this: a corroded heart. A corroded heart. Let's look at this. James chapter 5, beginning of verse 1. He says, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire." Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that we could probably spend some time on. But one of the things I want us to focus in on is this, that there will be a day when our riches will do us no good. They'll be worthless. There'll be no value. And all of those things that we have invested in will rot away. They'll be gone. They'll be useless. They're corroded, is the way James talks about it. They just corrode, and corrosion takes place. Now, as Western New Yorkers, we kind of feel this perhaps better than some people in different parts of the country when it comes to our vehicles, right? Yeah, it's a battle to keep a car rust-free in Western New York because of all the salt that we put on our roads, because of that crazy white stuff that comes out of the sky every year, the snow and the ice and the slush and all that stuff. So we put the salt down on the roads, and it gets into our cars, and what does it do? It rusts things. It corrodes things. That's a pretty good example of how we can spend so much money on something, and just in a few years, it just continues to drop in value. It corrodes. It rusts. See, corrosion eats away at something. Corrosion is something that makes whatever that thing is, it makes it kind of useless. It makes it ineffective. In fact, have you ever had a car that wouldn't start because the battery terminals were corroded? Anybody? Yeah, about half of us. And you're like, I can't figure out what's going on. I turn the key and nothing happens. Can't figure it out. Can't figure it out. This is supposed to work. And then you open up the hood, or somebody opens up the hood for you, and they look at the battery terminals, and they check those, and oh, well, this is kind of loose here, but look at all this corrosion around here. And then as soon as you get that cleaned up, it starts right up. See, that's what corrosion does. It makes something ineffective. A car that is designed to go at incredible speeds, like more than 50, somewhere around 55 to 60, 70, 80, 90, they'll do 100, I've been told. These cars that can do incredible speeds, because of the corrosion around the battery terminals, is now doing 0. They can't move until that corrosion issue gets taken care of. It makes that car ineffective. Corrosion also dulls the finish on things that ordinarily have great value. In this text, James talks about gold and silver that have been corroded. Something that's supposed to be beautiful and valuable can become tarnished because of this corrosion. I believe that this is true of our hearts as well. This is kind of where I'm going with this. I believe that this is a reflection of our hearts that become corroded. In fact, we've already looked at this text throughout this series, Matthew chapter 6. And the reason why we're looking at it again is because James has a way of echoing the words of Christ in the Sermon on the Mount. This is what Jesus says about our earthly treasures in Matthew 6:19. Jesus says, "Do not store for yourself treasure on earth, where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal." And then James adds, where valuables can be corroded, right? So don't store up these treasures, these earthly treasures. And then verse 20 he says this, "But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moth and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal." And then he tells us why. For where your heart is, there, or for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He says, listen, the things that we value most, the place where we place our highest treasure and our highest value, that tells us something about our hearts. Jesus talked more about talked more about money than heaven and hell combined. And both Jesus and James, they both tell us that our treasures on this earth, those things that we're so eager to chase after, they're temporary. They're temporary. And Jesus specifically says that where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. Chip Ingram wrote a book called The Genius of Generosity. The Genius of Generosity. And this is the way that he summarizes that. He says that where your money goes, your heart flows. Where your money goes, your heart flows. It's an indicator of what's going on the inside. And so if we're spending all of our money on our own pleasures, it's an indicator of what our heart is chasing after. It's like there's a string that's attached from our wallets to our hearts. And it's an indicator of what we value most. Those things that we invest in or spend our money on, it reveals our heart, it reveals our values. And the connection here is that if we treasure things that are going to corrode over time, it's an indicator of a corroded heart. We have a heart condition. And when our hearts are corroded, when they become corrupted, it makes us dull, it makes us ineffective as followers of Christ. That's the bad news. The good news is this, that when we loosen our grip on money, money loosens its grip on us. And once that happens, it begins to remove that corrosion that is around our hearts, that keeps us from being ineffective, doing the things that God has designed us to do. Like a car that can't do what it's designed to do if the terminals are corroded. So we have a corroded heart problem. The second thing is a stingy heart. A stingy heart. Listen to some more words that James has for us rich people. The end of verse 3 says this, James 5:3 says, "You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages that you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty." He's saying, listen, in our obsession for wealth, in our obsession for having more, we've become stingy. We've hoarded this all to ourselves. And on top of that, people that you owe money to for the work that they've done, you kept that all for yourself. You've got a problem here. While you're busy counting your money, you're taking advantage of other people. And God has heard their cries. See, a second heart condition that is a symptom of greed is a stingy heart. James talks about hoarding wealth and how we hoard it. We keep it all to ourselves. How many of you have ever seen the TV show Hoarders? Anybody? A few of us? Yeah. I think we've got a picture here. Yeah. Have you ever seen the pictures? And they just got stacks and stacks of worthless things. Stacks and stacks of newspapers. I think we have another picture here. Yeah. There's just stuff everywhere. Yeah, it stresses us out, right? There's stuff everywhere. In fact, you watch the show, and oftentimes, and maybe you've been in a house like this, and there's just like pathways. And you kind of meander through the house because of the pathways with all the stuff all over the place. I was looking through pictures myself, trying to get some good pictures of this terrible symptom thing, this terrible thing. And then I was reminded, I'm like, oh, that looks like my garage. In fact, when I went in, I asked Brody, hey, can you find me some pictures? He's like, we could probably just take pictures of our garage. That looks like all of our garages. I'm like, that's exactly what I thought. We have so much stuff. Now, I know, maybe your garage isn't like that, and now you're judging me. You've got another issue, so we'll get to it eventually, right? James talked about that earlier, right? But listen, we have all of this stuff. In fact, we have so much stuff that we have garages that are full, and we have porches that are full, and we have attics that are full, and basements that are full. And every available space on our property is so full that we have to have a storage facility to take it to, because our stuff is all full. We've hoarded it all to ourselves. We have so much stuff, so much clutter, that we can barely even walk around in our own homes. Yeah, I know that's kind of the extreme. You're thinking, well, I'm not that bad. We're worse than we think we are. We have so much stuff. You ever help move somebody? Yeah, yesterday, and Dave's not here, so I can pick on him. I'm not judging anything about Dave's stuff, but I think about it when I'm like, man, if I had to move tomorrow, I'd be in trouble. I'd have to get a dumpster. We'd have to have multiple garage sales, and we'd probably have to leave stuff in the house. And it'd be somebody else's problem, But we have so much stuff. I'm like, how did I get all this stuff? And especially when you live somewhere for a lengthy period of time, you accumulate all of this stuff. Floor to ceiling, we have stuff. And here's the thing. You watch the show Hoarders, and to the person that's hoarding all that stuff, it seems normal. It seems natural. It seems fine. When you're on the outside looking in, you're like, they have a problem. I think the same is true with us. For us, we get caught up in it. We don't happen to see the issue that is really going on. And the issue is us, and the issue is in our hearts. We have so much stuff. James says that there are those of us, we have hoarded wealth. Could you be talking about us? Could this be about us? We have so much, and yet at times we become very stingy about giving it away. James actually gave us an example of this in James 2:15. James 2:15, he says this, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food, right? And then he goes on. He says, if one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. So James gives an example of, listen, you have the wherewithal, you have the means to meet somebody else's need, but then you just kind of walk by. You hoarded that wealth to yourself. Shame on us. James is all about making sure that our faith and our deeds line up. Remember, we've said throughout the series, it's not what you know, it's what you do that matters. And this is just another example. In fact, James 4:17, we'll talk about this next week. James said, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. There are opportunities all around us to do good, to be generous, to be willing to share. And when we don't take those opportunities, perhaps that is sin for us. When we feel that God is telling us to do something and we don't do it, we have a problem, and it's called sin. It's pretty convicting, isn't it? See, a greedy heart is a stingy heart. And when we hoard wealth to ourselves, our hearts become cluttered. Just like the rooms of a hoarder's house, they become cluttered. And when we hoard wealth to ourselves, our hearts become cluttered. And it leaves no room for anyone else. And it leaves no room for God. But when we loosen our grip on money, money loosens its grip on us. So we have a corroded heart, we have a stingy heart, and then this next one is a self-indulgent heart. Self-indulgent heart, James 5:5 says this, you have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. And there's kind of a lot in there. Let me kind of talk about this briefly. I want to focus real quick on verse 6. I believe he's referring to rich people who are taking poor people to court and suing them for everything that they have. Remember, he talked about this earlier in chapter 2, verse 6. He says, isn't the rich that are condemning you, that are opposing you? And some of these people would have been condemned, perhaps even condemned to death. If not literally, certainly figuratively. Now that they've been condemned and their lives are over, they're ruined, they feel like, we might as well be dead. We don't have anything to show for our lives. You've condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. You've taken advantage of people. Back in verse 5, I won't spend a whole lot of time here because it's redundant. We've already been talking about this. But James is speaking to the rich and he's saying, listen, we've lived life here on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. We've had so much. And when we live this way, when we focus only on our own self-indulgence, if we focus only on our own wants and our own desires, it gets in the way of what God wants to do in us and through us in meeting the needs of others. You've made life all about you and what you can accumulate in your own luxury, in your own self-indulgence. C.S. Lewis writes this in his book, Mere Christianity. He says, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc. is up to the standard common among those within the same income as ours, we've probably given away too little. If our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I say they are too small. There ought to be things that we'd like to do and we cannot because our charitable expenditure excludes them. You understand what he's saying there? He's saying, listen, if you're at the same income level as somebody else and you have all of the same stuff that they have, chances are you're probably not giving away enough. There ought to be something different about us. Remember, we're talking about a contrasting worldview, the way that we see reality, the way that we see the people around us in the world, and it's shaped by our values. Saying we shouldn't be living like everybody else. There ought to be something different about us. He's also saying that we ought to give in such a way that it hurts a little bit. In a way that truly is a sacrifice. When we give, it ought to be sacrificial giving. We've used this example before, but if I had $1 million at my disposal and I gave you like $100, you wouldn't be thinking, man, that guy is so generous. But if I had $200 and I gave you $100, you'd be thinking, wow, that person is pretty generous. It ought to be sacrificial when we give. And the good news is that when we give sacrificially, it benefits others, and actually it benefits us as well. Why? Because when we loosen our grip on money, money loosens its grip on us. So what do we do about this? How do we address these three heart conditions? The corroded heart, the stingy heart, and the self-indulgent heart. I'm so glad you're asking that question right now, because it's going to be so helpful for us if we can actually apply something from this talk, right? What is the antidote to a greedy heart? Here it is. The antidote to a greedy heart is generosity. The antidote to a greedy heart is generosity. Once again, when we loosen our grip on money, money loosens its grip on us. But for the next couple minutes, I just want to look at one other text. It's found in 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy, Paul gives us some great advice on this topic. In 1 Timothy 6:17, he says this, and these are kind of some words that should ring familiar to us. He says, command those who are rich in this present world. Well, I'm not rich. I have to go back there again. We are rich, all right? Command those who are rich in this present world. He's talking about the world in which we live now, today. Command those who are rich in this present world to do what? Not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in what? In good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation. Now, just keep in mind the context here. A firm foundation is the opposite of earthly wealth, which is so uncertain. And then he says, for the coming age, that's the opposite of this present world. It's what we have to look forward to. And then he tells us why. He says, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. That's some incredible wisdom that Paul shares with us. Now, notice when Paul says this, he's not saying that being rich is a bad thing. He's saying, command those who are rich in this present world, and then he kind of goes through there. In fact, he says that God richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. So he's not saying that riches and wealth is a bad thing. He's saying, listen, you can enjoy it, but it needs to go beyond that. It can't just be for your enjoyment. So be thankful. Have a heart of gratitude for what God has given us and how he's blessed us, by all means. But at the same time, he gives us a warning. And he also gives us a command and a promise. And I want to real briefly talk about these things. The warning is, listen, don't be arrogant. Don't be arrogant. Don't place your hope in wealth. We can become arrogant because of our money. I have and somebody doesn't have. And sometimes that makes us arrogant. I have and you don't have. I've worked hard. Must be you haven't. I'm better than you because you don't have. He's saying, listen, don't be arrogant with your wealth. And at the same time, the other part of the warning is don't place your hope in wealth. Listen, if you place your hope in wealth, God can take it away in a moment. That happens to us too, As soon as you get a little extra income, it's like, look at this. And then all of a sudden, well, you got a little extra expense. Bob talked about that earlier, right? Don't place your hope in wealth. Don't let wealth become your God that you serve. Your wealth is uncertain. It is temporary. It is here today and gone tomorrow. But God is not. Don't place your hope in wealth. Place your hope in God. So that's the warning. The command is this. Be generous with your deeds and your money. Be generous with your deeds and your money. So if you're rich, and we all are, we're to be grateful for that. We're to enjoy it, but don't stop there. Be a rich doer and be a rich giver. Be generous with your time and with your money. By the way, for some of us, we'd rather give away our money than our time. And Paul is saying, listen, we need to be generous with both. See, God wants our heart. And those things that kind of compete for our allegiance to Him oftentimes is our time and our money because of the greed that we have inside of us. And so God is kind of requiring both. And the promise is this. The promise is eternal reward. See, God promises us that when we're generous with both our time and our money, He will reward us in heaven. Jesus says that when we live generous lives, we're storing up treasures in heaven. Randy Alcorn, who's an author and a pastor, he writes a lot about both money and heaven. He says this. He says, you can't take it with you, but you can send it ahead. You can't take it with you, but you can send it ahead. That's some profound insight. You can't take it with you. You know, we think about that when we think about death, right? You know, well, you can't take it with you. In fact, in all of my years of doing funerals, and I've done a lot of them, I've never once seen a hearse in a cemetery pulling a U-Haul trailer. It just doesn't happen. Those hearses don't even have trailer hitches. Because you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. And when we give generously, we set up a firm foundation for the future in heaven. And there is an eternal investment that takes place. So Paul says that when we're a rich doer and a rich giver, we're laying up treasure for ourselves for the future. And then he kind of uses this fascinating and almost this mysterious phrase. He says, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. See, for us, we tend to view things through the lens of what we see here and now, right? The things that we see, the things that we feel, the things that we taste and hear and smell. But Paul is indicating here that heaven is where true life is really experienced. And the future life is more real than what you're experiencing right now. And what you do now is setting up your eternal reward. See, when we begin to view life and our money through the lens of eternity, we begin to view things differently, don't we? We begin to see things differently. What is happening is our worldview is changing. And I think that's why both James and Paul talk about this and why Jesus talks about it so many times. We need to see things differently than the way everybody else sees it. And it may not make sense to us right now. Listen, generosity doesn't always make sense to us. Generosity is both counterintuitive and countercultural. And it doesn't always make sense. But once again, when we loosen our grip on money, money loosens its grip on us. And we begin to live life with open hands rather than closed fists. You know, someone once said it this way, you know, when we live like this, as opposed to this, God doesn't have to pry our fingers apart to get it out of our hands. So we need to live our lives more like this, with open hands, rather than with closed fists. And generosity is an example of living life with open hands. It's saying, God, it's not mine. It's yours. See, I believe that God owns it all. He owns it all, including the stuff in your wallet. God owns that. He owns it all. He entrusts us with some. And He expects us to be generous as givers. Now, I'm not talking about our morning offering this morning. All right, this isn't like a big setup for the offering. I'm talking about living a life of generosity outside of these walls, with the people that we come in contact with. See, the antidote to greed is generosity. This is something that we struggle with. So how do we overcome this issue in our lives? It's through generosity. This week, I would encourage you to be generous in your deeds and with your money. Think about it. At different opportunities throughout the week, take some time to be intentional about this. When you eat out, why don't you be generous when you give that tip to that waitress? Be generous with that. If you have an invite card, that would be great to leave the invite card for Ojai Community Church. If you're not going to leave a tip, do not leave the invite card. Okay? Well, there's heaven in it. Yeah, listen, we need to be good representatives of Christ. We need to be generous with those around us. Be generous with our deeds and with our finances, with our money. Perhaps you may see somebody in front of you at the grocery line and you want to pay for their groceries. That would be awesome. Pay for somebody else's meal. See what it does to your heart. It's certainly going to bless them, but I think that you're going to find that it does something to you as well. It will begin to loosen that grip of money that we hold on so tightly, and it holds tightly on us as well. Show kindness to people in need of help. Serve those around you. So if you're rich, and you are, we are, be grateful for it, enjoy it, thank God for it, but don't stop there. Be a rich doer and a rich giver. Be a generous person. Chip Ingram, once again, he writes in the book, The Genius of Generosity, he says this. It's a pretty good quote. He says, to be smart, spend carefully. To be wise, save regularly. But to be genius, give extravagantly. You see a progression there? You know, obviously we want to be smart, so we need to spend carefully. We need to budget. You know, to be wise, save regularly. But to be genius, give extravagantly. You know, my prayer is that when people see us, that they'll see that there's something different about us. The way that we live, the way that we love people, the way that we serve, the way that we treat the people around us, the way that we just show love, the way that we're generous, that they would see that there's something so different about us. Because our worldview that has been deeply shaped by Scripture, because we've seen it modeled in the life of Christ, because we've seen it modeled in other people's lives, that they see that there's something different about us. And when they see that difference in us, we will gain an opportunity to share Christ with them. But as long as we're tight-fisted, and as long as we are kind of reserved and we don't show generosity, as long as we're greedy like everybody else, there's nothing different for them to see in us. There ought to be something different. This week, I hope you'll take advantage of some of this and that you'll live a life of generosity.